MDMA's neurotoxicity has been a highly contentious topic for decades. Ever since the 1980s, you've had people on one side claiming the drug is terrible for brain health, and even just a few uses could damage nerve cells. On the other side, you've had people emphatically stating most of the studies are flawed and MDMA isn't clearly toxic. While the middle way doesn't always apply, I think it does here. The research has indeed been marred by problematic methodology and unsubstantiated conclusions, but it really does appear MDMA can be problematic. It's either neurotoxic or at least capable of triggering serotonergic dysfunction. This has been shown in animals and to a lesser extent in humans. While there's still a lot of debate about whether the things being shown are truly neurotoxicity, the existence of some kind of negative change is not heavily disputed. Therefore, safety precautions really should be taken. We have pretty good reason to believe MDMA can be used in a relatively safe way, but you should be cognizant of the potential issues. I'm going to explore some of the evidence for serotonergic dysfunction, the apparent route of toxicity, and the behaviors and supplements that may reduce your risk. There are other toxicity and safety issues that I'll be discussing elsewhere on the Drug Classroom, and there will be more info on this topic on the website. This research has long been complicated and controversial. There are some notable problems and limitations with the research overall. Some of the issues are animals being exposed to dosing that's not reflective of human use, and MDMA being tested on mice even though they have a different response to MDMA than rats, other primates, and humans. An even bigger problem that's luckily quite rare is the administration of a drug other than MDMA by accident. Famously, a study from George Riccardi accidentally used methamphetamine in place of MDMA and showed dopaminergic toxicity in primates. This was a fairly influential paper at the time, but it was later retracted. With the human research, there are some other problems that leave us unsure of the relevance of the studies. First, they tend to involve polydrug use. While this can be controlled for to a fair degree, it's not ideal. Second, the users have been taking MDMA multiple times per month and have used it on hundreds of occasions. Third, many of the users could have been taking something other than MDMA. And fourth, pre-existing differences typically can't be ruled out. Some people believe there's another issue, which is that there's a publication bias towards negative effects. And when studies are published that show, at most, moderate issues, the conclusions from the authors may be much more dramatic. An example of this is with a prospective study published in 2007. The authors claimed to show even a first low cumulative dose of ecstasy is associated with decline in verbal memory. And, on average, the subjects in the study are over 18 years, but the implications for those under 18 are the same, that even one exposure to MDMA can cause lasting defects to cognition, a sobering thought. But what did their data actually show? They found all cognitive tests were normal, and those who started using ecstasy did not have declines in verbal memory. The entire claim was based around there not being an increase in verbal memory, unlike the non-users. Perhaps this is concerning, but the study didn't quite show what it claimed, and we've seen other instances where researchers use entirely inadequate data to oppose the MDMA therapy research from MAPS, which isn't justifiable. That being said, although it's clear the literature is far from ideal, not everything within it can be ignored. The main claims about MDMA are that it leads to long-term depletion of serotonin, long-term 5-HIAA depletions, reduced serotonin transporter (SERT) availability, and impaired cognition. There may also be an extended decline in tryptophan hydroxylase. Even if serotonergic markers return to normal, some studies argue cognitive deficits could be persistent. Most authors claim MDMA seems to cause an axotomy. This means the cell bodies don't generally appear affected, but the axons and axon terminals may be damaged and could eventually degenerate. As we'll see, there are arguments against MDMA causing axon terminal destruction. Some of the most widely cited studies in animals show MDMA leads to dose-dependent reductions in serotonergic markers for months and even years. This has been shown in rats and non-human primates. Scheffel reported that 5 milligrams per kilogram in a baboon twice per day for 4 days led to a decline in SERT binding in the thalamus, striatum, and cortical regions. This was reported 13 days after the last dose, 9 months after, and even at 13 months. There was some recovery during that time, but binding appeared to still be down in the frontal, parietal, and occipital cortex. A 1999 study in monkeys used 5 milligrams per kilogram twice daily for 4 days, and found there might be decreased serotonin axon density in certain brain regions for up to 7 years. Schmidt reported 10 milligrams per kilogram in rats led to a significant drop in serotonin 6 days after dosing. O'Shea found that while 4, 10, and 15 milligrams per kilogram in rats all led to temperature increases, the neurotoxic-like changes varied. 10 and 15 milligrams per kilogram clearly caused serotonergic changes, but 4 milligrams per kilogram failed to have a significant effect. That same dose also failed to cause significant negative effects when given twice weekly for 8 weeks, and Bauman administered rats 3 injections of either 1.5 or 7.5 milligrams per kilogram. The rats were killed 2 weeks later. 7.5 milligrams led to persistent hyperthermia and significant serotonin depletion, but 1.5 milligrams per kilogram did not. When it comes to interpreting the animal results, there are 2 main viewpoints. One group says the dosing is fine since interspecies scaling is superior to using the same milligram per kilogram dose between species. The other group argues the dose in rats or monkeys should be close to what humans are using. I typically fall in the first group, as some form of interspecies scaling is generally useful and necessary. Once you're actually testing a drug in animals and humans, other comparisons can be made. You can look at which dose leads to a certain effect, or, even better, which dose leads to similar pharmacokinetic parameters. When you focus on pharmacokinetics, the need for higher doses in animals is clear. To get the peak plasma concentration that 2 milligrams per kilogram provides in humans, rats need closer to 7 milligrams per kilogram. And on a functional measure, like a 0.6 degrees Celsius increase, the human dose is around 1.4 milligrams per kilogram, while the rat dose is 5 milligrams per kilogram. For humans compared to monkeys, you'll get a similar peak concentration with 1.6 milligrams per kilogram in humans and 2.8 milligrams per kilogram in monkeys. However, the area under the curve will be much smaller in monkeys. To get a similar AUC, you need about 5.7 milligrams per kilogram in monkeys, yet this comes at the expense of a much higher peak concentration. Due to the different pharmacokinetics between species, exactly matching drug exposure likely isn't possible. For now, the bulk of the evidence supports giving rats and monkeys more than humans. But we're still left with the problem that some of the most concerning studies have used dosing regimens which go well beyond what scaling would instruct. This includes the baboon and monkey studies using 5 milligrams per kilogram multiple times per day for 4 days. That kind of regimen really doesn't replicate human use. Another issue centers around claiming the serotonergic data we have is evidence of neurotoxicity. Few studies have examined more specific markers of toxicity, and when they have, more confusing results start to appear. Some of the best evidence in favor of the neurodegeneration hypothesis is from immunohistochemical visualization of serotonergic fibers. These studies have shown MDMA can cause transient swelling and fragmentation of serotonin immunoreactive fibers in the forebrain of rats, followed by the disappearance of the fibers. Because cells within the raphe nuclei didn't go away, this was taken as evidence of MDMA causing distal exotomies. Longer-term studies sometimes show gradual recovery of fiber density in the range of a couple months to a year. This evidence is pretty concerning, but there's another way to look at it. An alternative hypothesis is that MDMA-induced serotonin deficits come from lasting adaptive changes in gene expression or protein function, not from classic neurotoxicity. Some of the evidence in favor of this hypothesis comes from potentially better tools. A study utilizing fluorojade B staining, which can be used to look for degeneration, found that 1 out of 4 rats given 10 milligrams per kilogram exhibited staining in the cortex. The same rat had significant hyperthermia, and most of the staining appeared to be with the non-serotonergic cells, which doesn't fit with the alleged neurotoxicity pattern of MDMA. Another tool is looking at levels of GFAP, which is considered a marker of toxicity. O'Callaghan found up to 30 milligrams per kilogram twice daily for 7 days failed to change GFAP expression, despite significant reductions in serotonin levels. When the dose increased to 75 to 150 milligrams per kilogram, GFAP was significantly elevated, but that dose is incredibly high. These results are distinct from what you see with 5,7-dihydroxytryptamine, which appears to be a neurotoxin. At doses that lead to comparable serotonin depletion, only 5,7-DHT increased GFAP. Another paper from 2003 involving 20 milligrams per kilogram in rats for 4 days showed a decline in SIRT, but no effect on reactive gliosis as measured by GFAP. MDMA also had no effect on other microglial markers. Multiple studies have therefore shown that supposedly neurotoxic doses of MDMA don't impact astroglial or microglial markers of neural damage. This goes against the existence of clear-cut, non-debatable neurotoxicity at doses relevant to humans. Some research has also looked at the effects on other markers like VMAT2, which is concentrated in monoamine nerve terminals. It was found that multiple doses of MDMA could lead to significant SIRT reductions, but there wasn't an impact on synaptosomal VMAT2 expression. This could indicate MDMA's impact on SIRT occurs in the absence of axonal destruction. There is pretty clear evidence of serotonergic downregulation, but there remains a question about if this is truly evidence of neurodegeneration. We still don't know the answer, and even the existence of non-exotomy changes still means MDMA may cause serotonergic dysfunction. For this reason, precautions should be taken and use should be minimized. As I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of problems with the human literature, so those should be kept in mind as I go through some of the papers. Morgan compared recreational MDMA users to polydrug controls and non-drug using controls. Most of the MDMA participants felt their use was associated with the negative effects like anxiety, mood swings, and impaired memory. Testing found that MDMA users were impaired for recall performance compared to the other groups. Their impairment was associated with how long they had been abstinent. The average lifetime use was 50 tablets. Raineman found MDMA users abstinent for 2.4 months had significantly lower cortical SIRT binding, while X users abstinent for 29 months did not. Both MDMA groups recalled significantly fewer words on immediate and delayed recall tests. Higher lifetime use was correlated with worse performance. The MDMA user and X user groups had taken 485 and 268 tablets respectively. McCann found ecstasy users with an average of 215 uses who were abstinent for 14 weeks had significantly lower 5-HIAA concentrations. They also had impairments on sustained attention, short-term memory, and working memory. Another report found very heavy ecstasy users had a lower SIRT binding when abstinent for a mean of 24 days. That changed to being very close to controls once there was more than a year of abstinence. Quiche examined ecstasy users with a lifetime consumption of 206 pills and 45 days of abstinence. They had mild to marked declines in SIRT binding in the cerebral cortex and hippocampus, but not the striatum. And a study in 2009 didn't find reduced SIRT binding in former MDMA users with an average abstinence of over 2 years. There's some evidence that MDMA users might have different responses to stress and be more prone to mood issues, but there's not much evidence in this area that's clearly applicable to reasonable users. I've only covered a tiny portion of the available papers, though they all generally point in the same direction. MDMA users, especially those with heavy use, seem to have memory-related impairments. They also appear to have serotonergic changes that last for weeks and months, but possibly not years. More information on this topic is available on the Drug Classroom website. After decades of research, two primary routes of dysfunction have continued to pop up. The first major factor is MDMA's metabolism, and the second is dopamine oxidation and/or deamination following its presence in serotonergic nerve terminals. Both of those can result in the generation of reactive oxygen species. And MDMA's metabolites aren't just problematic in the brain, they could also lead to toxicity elsewhere in the body, such as the liver. On top of these mechanisms, some other factors appear appear to exist. Studies have found that ambient temperature can be the deciding factor for whether a certain dose is neurotoxic. Hyperthermia could also play a role in cellular energy disruption, which could contribute to toxicity. Malberg found 20 or 40 milligrams per kilogram in rats could cause hypothermia or hyperthermia depending on the temperature. Low temperatures around 20 degrees Celsius were protective against serotonergic deficits, with higher temperatures causing progressively greater changes. Another factor is pre-existing stress. Johnson found increasing stress in rats for 10 days before MDMA resulted in greater hyperthermia and greater serotonin depletion. This seemed to be the result of higher glucocorticoid levels. Getting back to metabolism, MDMA injected directly into the brain has been found to lack the dysfunctional effects seen when the drug is given systemically. This has been a key piece of evidence supporting the role of metabolism. MDMA's primary metabolite is N-methyl-alpha-methyldopamine. HHMA is easily oxidized due to its catechol moiety, and the corresponding quinone is generated. The quinone can enter redox cycles, leading to reactive oxygen species. The ROS that may ultimately be involved include superoxide, hydroxyl radicals, and hydrogen peroxide. The quinone can also be conjugated with glutathione and N-acetylcysteine, forming conjugates that are further metabolized into toxic chemicals. Another metabolite of MDMA is MDA, which leads to HHA, otherwise known as alpha-methyldopamine. Like with HHMA, HHA can ultimately lead to ROS formation and toxicity, though this route may be less important than the HHMA route. It appears some of the glutathione and NAC conjugates of HHA and HHMA can produce behavioral effects and neurotoxicity or dysfunction. The glutathione metabolites may be formed in the liver and transported into the brain through the glutathione transport mechanism. Detoxification appears heavily reliant on CoMT, an enzyme whose activity can vary between individuals. A 2008 paper found the CoMT inhibitor, entacapone, could increase MDMA's serotonin depletion in rats. Some of these metabolites may end up being connected to dopamine-mediated problems. The glutathione conjugates might stimulate dopamine uptake into cells expressing the serotonin transporter. This could result in ROS formation from the transformation of dopamine. We still need more evidence for the presence of these metabolites in humans, though there's at least evidence for a couple N-acetylcysteine metabolites showing up in human urine following MDMA use. The traditional dopamine hypothesis probably doesn't account for MDMA's effect. It claimed that depleted serotonergic terminals would take in dopamine through SERT, leading to damage. There has been some evidence supporting this, such as selegiline, an MAOB inhibitor, being able to prevent the loss of SERT and serotonin from MDMA, but there's also conflicting evidence. A 2002 study found significantly depleting dopamine didn't prevent serotonin issues. And we also know some of the areas affected by MDMA are sparsely innervated by dopamine neurons. A more recent view of the dopamine situation has to do with tyrosine. MDMA can reportedly increase tyrosine in dopamine-sparse brain regions. It can then be non-enzymatically converted to dopa, a process that occurs in a pro-oxidant environment inside of serotonin terminals. Hydroxyl radicals, possibly originating from MDMA's metabolism, could enable the ultimate conversion of tyrosine to dopamine. Areas like the hippocampus may be more vulnerable to this damage due to tyrosine preferentially accumulating in serotonergic versus dopaminergic terminals. It therefore appears that dopamine together with MDMA's metabolites may be a primary source of dysfunction. Hyperthermia isn't necessarily required for problems, but it seems to clearly exacerbate them. Knowing all of this, perhaps the most important question is what can you do about MDMA safety issues? Some of the things I recommend include the following. Avoid drug combinations, specifically stimulants like cocaine, amphetamines, and caffeine. Avoid or at least minimize redosing, especially given the acute safety concerns. And it's also wise to stick with common doses. A lot of people act as though 300 milligrams or more is a reasonable dose, but that's not the case. If you want to maximize the chance of negative negative effects on the brain, using it like that is a good way to do so. Based on animal research, hyperthermia is a factor in the toxic potential of MDMA. We know humans can become hyperthermic even in controlled settings when using common doses. This can be exacerbated in settings filled with a lot of activity, crowding, and high ambient temperatures. In other words, two of the most common environments for MDMA use, music festivals and clubs, are some of the worst places to take it. Normally, when people are stressed from heat, they'll change their behavior in order to cool down. This protective response is often absent in MDMA users. In fact, some people prefer being warmer when they're on the drug, and they end up boosting their temperature through clothing and dancing. Ideally, you wouldn't be taking it in that kind of setting. If you do, you should definitely take breaks to cool down. This means no longer dancing, as well as separating from the crowd. This is also a good time to rehydrate and make sure your electrolytes are in check. A number of studies have looked at various substances, some of which are common supplements, to see if they can reduce MDMA-related dysfunction. Those that may have positive results include N-acetylcysteine, Alcar, alpha-lipoic acid, vitamin E, vitamin C, MK801, THC, ginger, memantine, and sildenafil. Depending on the substance, the mechanism of protection might differ. Between the aforementioned drugs, there are antioxidant mechanisms, NMDA antagonism, and hyperthermia reduction. This research is definitely encouraging, as it suggests there are ways to reduce MDMA's negative effects, especially when used in conjunction with typical harm reduction measures. But it's also difficult to turn this research into recommendations for humans. I don't want to endorse any of these drugs specifically as a way to prevent toxicity, and you definitely shouldn't feel like you've prevented all possible issues just by taking some vitamin C. With that in mind, I think some of the options for reducing toxicity include the use of N-acetylcysteine, vitamin C, and alpha-lipoic acid. These could be taken in the lead up to your use, while you're on the drug, and after the effects end. I've only gone through a portion of the available information in this video. If you want to learn more, I recommend visiting the Drug Classroom website using the link in the description. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the comments. The Drug Classroom is exclusively funded by donations. If you'd like to support, please do so on patreon.com/thedrugclassroom.